Hello and welcome back. sleepywhatsit here, and I have another miniatures video for you. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the new Necron plus Paint and Space Marine Assault Intercessor plus Paint sets from Games Workshop. These are the new Learn to Paint sets that are being released along with 9th edition Warhammer 40k. Previously, I've reviewed the older 8th edition equivalent sets and the Age of Sigmar sets. So this video is going to be a bit of a rehash of some of the points I made in my previous videos on these Model Plus Paint sets, but with some updates in line with the changes they've made to these sets. We're going to start by just looking around the outside of the boxes. Here we have the Necron box, this time forgoing the gatefold style packaging of the previous edition sets. When we flip it around here on the back, we can see what actually comes in the box. Like the previous sets, you get a sprue with some push-fit miniatures, 6 pots of paint, and a starter brush. The painting instructions have managed to somehow become even more brief and useless than what they were on the previous edition, though this time we do appear to have been provided with full assembly instructions, so I guess we lose some, we gain some. They also updated the iconography to indicate that other tools like sprue clippers are needed, which I assume is in response to them getting complaints about from people being like, I didn't know I needed other things. And here we have the new Space Marines box, which contains the new Primaris Assault Intercessors instead of the normal Primaris Intercessors that came in the previous edition, though it is the same basic box design as the Necron box, sparse painting instruction and such on the back. Now let's move on to the actual contents of these boxes. Here we have the little starter brush that we get. It's something like either a smaller or medium-sized layer brush. I've heard a lot of hate for these starter brushes, but I found them to be perfectly serviceable for beginner projects, though I've never gone to dud one, which I think is where most people are gaining their hate from. They're not great brushes, so replacing the starter brush would be probably one of the first things I would do if I was going to go further in the hobby from one of these kits. Interestingly, the bases here have a hex hole in them instead of either being flat with no hole or having a slot in them. That's the first time I've seen that, so it'll be interesting to see how it works. And now we have the 3 new Necron Warrior models on a sprue. Previously, Necrons weren't available in a push-fit format to my knowledge, so this is pretty neat, making them a little bit more accessible. The paints for our Necrons that we have, I think, are a noticeable improvement over the paints that were available in the older edition of these model and paint sets. Specifically, I think they've chosen noticeably brighter colors, as well as some of the paints they've chosen I think were just a strict improvement over the previous one. So let's go through what we actually have here for paints. First up, we have Abaddon Black, which is the bog standard black that GW seems to put in everything these days. Then we have Runelord Brass, which is a nice bright yellow metallic paint. Then we have our Runefang Steel, which is a bright gray metallic, much brighter than the Lead Belcher that has appeared in a lot of the older kits. For our shade, we have Agrex Earthshade, which is a solid dark brown tone. Nuln Oil, which is a black tone, I think would have been a good choice also here. I personally would have preferred them to include the new Cryptic Armor shade here, but I understand why, for a beginner's kit, they chose to go with one of the more traditional colors. And then for our technical paints, we get the new Tesseract Glow, which should be really good for painting OSL and glow effects on our models. And for basing, we've been provided with Asher Granite, which I think is a better selection than the older kit's choice of Armageddon Dunes. I personally prefer using gray-orientated color schemes on my bases so they don't draw attention away from the model, so something like Asher Granite works better than Armageddon Dunes, which was a yellow, so I think that's a noticeable improvement. Now let's go over to see what we get in the Space Marines box. Again, we have these new style hex hole bases, so I guess that's a thing that we're doing with 9th edition now. The brush we get here is a little bit of a rougher looking point, probably because it lost its sleeve in transport, but as you can see, it can still hold a point. We have another sprue of push-fit miniatures, this time the newer Assault Intercessor Primaris Marines. I think these Marine models are an improvement over the previous Intercessors push-fit models for beginners kits. These models don't include a figure with an exposed head, so the kit doesn't have to dedicate one of its colors to a flesh tone. Additionally, I find the poses that they've chosen to go with here are a little bit more open, so you have a little bit less like arms crossing the body and things like that make it difficult for them to be painted fully assembled. I don't think it's really reasonable for a beginner painter to be expected to paint their models in sub-assemblies, especially with no instruction telling them to do that. So let's actually move on to what we get for paints. Since these are meant to be painted as ultramarines, the primary color for the models is going to be MacLeod blue. Again, we have Abaddon black, because that is the black that they use. It would be nice to get a pot of Corvus black, but c'est la vie. I wish GW still made Imperial primer, so that they could include a black/primer combo in these kits, because the lack of primer is probably one of their biggest faults, I think, personally. For the other matte paint, we get Corax white, so we can do things like freehanding the Ultramarine logos, since we didn't get any transfers for that. The metallic that we've been supplied with is Balthazar gold. I personally preferred a brighter gold tone, like Retributor armor, like they did in the Necron kit, with going with a brighter brass and a brighter gray metal, just because these kits are a little bit of a base and shade type thing. For the shade paint, we get Agrax Earthshade, and again for basing, we get Astrogranite. So in comparison to what you got in the 9th edition kits, the Death Guard and the Intercessor, or the Age of Sigmar's Night Haunt and Stormcast kits, you end up with a little bit more of overlap in your paints, since there's 3 duplicates between the 2 sets, so you effectively get 9 unique paints. On the other hand, these overlapping paints, Abaddon Black, Agrax Earthshade, and Astrogranite, are all colors that are applicable to many projects, because you're going to use a lot of black, you're going to use a lot of brown tone shades, and you're probably going to be basing with something like Astrogranite, so you're going to get a lot of use out of them. So it's not like you've ended up with duplicates of a color that are very specific. If you have both kits, the Corax White could also be used as an underkit coat on your Necrons for areas that you're going to be applying that Tesseract glow to improve the OSL effect that you get there. So let's move on to my overall kind of thoughts and opinions of who these kits are good and bad for. I think they made some noticeable improvements to them in comparison to the previous kits, but there's definitely still some room for improvement. I think the paint selection is overall better, especially with regards to the Necron kit. I also think that the model selection is an improvement over the previous beginner kits because they're a little bit more approachable. I do think they're still falling down substantially on the instructions. When you compare them to something like Reaper's Learn to Paint kits, it's borderline embarrassing how little instructions you're actually provided with here. They did add assembly instructions, which is nice, but then they took away anything resembling painting instructions and just left us with a vague picture, so that's kind of disappointing. Like with the Age of Sigmar and the previous 8th edition kits, I do plan on making paint-along videos to attempt to address some of this lack of painting instruction. When those are complete and I've uploaded them, I'll put link cards up here and then links down in the description, so if you're from the far distant future, you can go see those immediately. These kits don't include a number of the basic supplies that you're going to need, things like sprue clippers, a hobby knife, things like that, glue, but I can forgive them at this price point for not including all that, given that they do have another kit, the Tools and Paint kit, that does supply most of that. So my broad recommendation is, if you're excited about 9th edition and have never done any type of Warhammer miniature hobbying before, this is a reasonable starting point. It isn't perfect, and it isn't a complete all-in starter kit, but it's definitely something you could build around as a new hobbyist as your starter kit, and you get good bang for your buck in comparison to buying all the parts separately. If you're someone that's already into non-GW minis, like you paint D&D or something else, this is a decent way to get into 40k if you're interested in the models and paints that are associated, like that entire system. If you're someone that is already bought into the Games Workshop ecosystem, you play 8th edition or Age of Sigmar or one of their many other games, and you have a large set of existing Citadel paints and tools, then these kits are probably not the best starting place for you, since you're going to get a lot of duplicate paints. There aren't that many unique paints other than the Tesseract Gold. With the older 8th edition kits, I would have just recommended that you just buy the models and the paints that you're missing, but as of the recording of this video, the sprues are not actually available in separate kits right now. Until those become available, I would suggest something like the Recruit starter set for 9th edition to get additional models, and then you can buy the specific paints you're missing. since you're not really losing out on like lack of not getting the instructions since you saw what they are on the box. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video informative. If you do, please give it a like. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to the channel. If you want to see what I'm currently working on, feel free to follow me on various social media platforms. I sometimes do chill painting streams over on Twitch, so you can follow along for that also. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.